Good afternoon and welcome everybody. So honored that you took time out to join us on this beautiful day when you could have been doing lots of things out on the beach, but it's important to take this time to have conversations with each other. So on behalf of the chairman, Joseph Feaster, and the extraordinary board of directors for the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts, I want to thank you for tuning in to our Leaders Over Lunch series. And today's topic: what's the cost of the pandemics on Black and Brown communities? I'm Keith Motley. Now, some of you probably are used to me showing up with a chancellor hat on or a professor hat on or something like that. But today I am here and I'm humbly here in service to you as consultant, president, and CEO of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts for this session. And I am so grateful for our opportunity. And so I want to begin today by taking a moment of silence before we get started, because we had two of our civil rights titans, Reverend C.T. Vivian and also Congressman the Honorable John Lewis, but also we lost a lot of family members and others during this COVID. So I'd like to take a moment of silence to begin to give praise and thanks for their being and for their existing on this earth. Thank you, everybody. So let's talk a little bit about this Leaders Over Lunch series. It's a series that we decided to do as an Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts to have conversations with women and men in leadership so we can show off their excellence, of course, but we also want to be able to dig into some deep issues around business, government, community development, and to have candid conversations with them. So I'm incredibly proud today to have the opportunity to have this kind of conversation about our strengths, about our weaknesses, about our threats and opportunities as a community, and what is important to all of us. However, I would also like to just thank our special guests for showing up today. And I want to remind you that during this session, you can use our question and answer feature, which is used to ask any questions that you like, and I'll get to them if I can. But I also want to thank the staff that has helped put this together today. Thank you to Natalie Haywood. Thank you to Alvin Peters. Thank you to Neil Uter, and also to William Watkins, but to all of the Urban League staff for all that you continue to do. So this is going to be an hour-long program, and we're going to end right at 1 o'clock today. So we want you to sit back, enjoy your lunch, and enjoy this conversation. So I'm honored today as the host for this session to welcome our special guest, Shelley Stewart III. He's a partner at McKinsey and Company. He's representing the next generation of outstanding leaders in incredible ways. And before I start, I want to also give out a shout out to those who produced them, my brother and sister who happen to be his mother and father, Shelley Stewart and Ann Stewart. Thank you for being the kind of parents that would produce an incredible young man like this and an incredible leader. Let me tell you a little bit about Shelley. He's an active participant and leader in driving national initiatives in both recruiting and external relations on behalf of McKinsey Black Network. He's a public scholar and a thought leader. He co-leads McKinsey's research on building Black wealth in the United States. He's an advisor to the New Jersey Law and Education Empowerment Program, a not-for-profit serving underprivileged high school students in the greater Newark community. He's all over the place. He's also a member of the Advisory Council for the National Black MBA. Now, he's here today because not only is he an incredible thought leader and thinker, he's also an incredible writer. And so there are several titles that he's participated in. Um, just a few of them: Automation and the Future of the African American Workforce, The Future of Work in Black America, The Economic Impact of Closing the Racial Wealth Gap, COVID-19's Effect on Minority-Owned Small Businesses in the United States, COVID-19, Investing in Black Lives and Livelihoods, and The Case for Accelerating Financial Inclusion in Black Communities. He is Boston College educated, but he also is someone who's been educated by lots of experiences that have made a difference. And then he went on to Columbia University to earn his MBA. And so, why this conversation today? This conversation is necessary because we want to continue to push the envelope, but also to make change. It's our opportunity, and we want to seize the time to do that. Why, Keith? Because the average white family has 31 days of liquid savings on hand, and Black families only have 5 days. Why, Keith? Because 33% of the incarcerated population happens to look like most of you on this call, almost triple the Black citizens' share of the US population. The Black community has the lowest median income and wealth of any ethnic group. They donate 1.6 to 4 times more than other demographic groups. Black and brown communities receive $19 per person of public-private funding, while other communities receive $46, and Native American communities receive $586 per person. Close to 80% of whites own a home, whereas only 1/3 of US Blacks do. And so we could go on and on and on and on. Total unemployment in Massachusetts has reached over 1,076,506,000 who have filed for unemployment here. And the Pioneer Institute of Public Policy Research indicates in some of our neighborhoods, the unemployment rate in Roxbury, 27%. The unemployment rate in Dorchester, 30%. And when you go to Mattapan, 26% and rising. And so this conversation is needed today. But before we get started, I want to start, Shelley, by welcoming you. How are you, man? I'm so grateful to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, listen, we are so grateful, man, that you decided to stop in on the Urban League and a few of our friends today.
Of course, the Urban League is a very storied and important institution, today, and as important as ever. So I'm doing okay. I am very fortunate, Dr. Motley, to have to be employed, to have a family that's healthy. My wife and I welcomed a new son into the world.
Congratulations!
Thank you. About 6 months ago, so he was born, right on the precipice of all this madness. But I am well aware that I have a lot to be grateful and thankful for, and so I just have been trying to think about ways that I can use my skills, my experience, and my position at my company to help elevate a dialogue about what's going on in this country with respect to to Black Americans and other vulnerable people.
So unpack that a little bit for me. Why is it important for you to personally engage in the development of all these reports that I see that you have been writing, particularly when you talk about the opportunity that we have as a people, and as we look and think about all those who've made these sacrifices, who prepared a space for you to sit in the seat that you sit in today. So why is it important on a personal level? Unpack that a little bit for me, and why you want to personally engage in the development of these kind of reports.
No question that we have made progress in this country, and as you mentioned earlier, we took this moment of silence for two incredibly inspirational leaders who did so much to pave the way, and just the same way you did, and my father and my mother in your own time. I believe that everyone needs to evaluate in the context of their moment and the resources at their disposal, how they can agitate for change, right? So I consider myself, an economic activist, and I fundamentally believe that many of the issues that we face today, as particularly as Black Americans, but other groups as well, link to the fragility of our economic circumstances, whether that's criminal justice outcomes, whether that is health disparity, you name it. And so I work at a company that, in a partnership that serves private sector companies, we serve governments, we serve not-for-profits. We sit at that central point of convening. And what do we try to do? We try to solve difficult problems with our clients. And so what more difficult a problem than this big intractable or seemingly intractable wealth gap issue? And so my view is, being an economic activist, how do I leverage that platform, that problem-solving approach that McKinsey brings to bear on something that I think will have impact for generations if we make some progress?
So I heard you say in our time, man, and I know that all of our time is now. That's the beauty of today. And so I know that your parents were probably cringing a little bit because in our time tries to make us sound a little old or something. But the reality is that I understand what you were talking about. But given the times, what are your feelings and thoughts about, this Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, DJ Henry murders and Black Lives Matter movement and all of that? Are you writing anything related to that now?
So let me first clarify. You're absolutely right. By no means have you all passed the torch, because there's so much more work to be done. And frankly, you're in different places with different levels of influence and different networks. So let me be clear about that. We still stand on your shoulders while you keep moving at emotion.
Pandemic makes you a little sensitive, man.
No, I understand. I understand.
I don't have the gray hair that most of my colleagues, because I don't have any of that.
I understand.
But many of them are suffering from the itis, the aging itis, because you look in the mirror and now you realize that time is passing. But then we look at you and we feel blessed by you and the others that we see doing the work. So that was more of a tease.
No, I understand. And look, I think, so George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, we did continue to say their names, so I'm glad that you set it up that way. It represents what we know, again, are long-standing disparities with respect to the way many of our systems operate. Criminal justice system being just one example of that, right? There are many folks that are now talking about the kind of the separate criminal justice system, one for people with means, one for everyone else, and then maybe the one for everyone else even has a slightly different iteration for young Black folks. And so I think that this national dialogue around and this reckoning that is just being caught on camera, that most of us knew was already going on at levels that we should all be ashamed and appalled of, I think it's important. And when I think to what does that mean for the work that I'm doing, I think there are many folks who are better positioned to focus specifically on the police brutality, the criminal justice reform angle. I think it's important. What I'm trying to stay focused on to contribute to that is, how do we, so there, in many ways, I feel like poverty has been criminalized in a lot of context. And so if I just set aside and say there's a set of people working on the decriminalization of poverty, I'm going to work on the depovertying of poverty, right? So how do we build more equitable systems that start by investing in communities where Black folks and brown folks live, and follows all the way through to meaningful employment and access to the financial services sector so they can build wealth, so they can be insured, and how do we, what are the set of interventions that we can start to push from the private, public, social sector to start to reduce the levels of poverty, which will also reduce the level of disparities in some of these other contexts, like criminal justice outcomes or health disparity.
So we appreciate your focus on building wealth in these communities. And so what is race role in that disparity? You know, this cause for the wealth gap for Black and brown people. Sort of break that down a little bit for us.
Yes. So the starting point is a fact that we talk about a lot, which is if you just look today, the median Black family has about 1/10 the wealth of the median white family. I mean, that's a staggering difference. And you know, most of the folks, and if not everyone on this discussion, knows the history of how we got here. And so now I think the question is, you know, what do we do from here? So what we've been doing is we've tried to dissect and understand what are the different elements or the different stages in life where wealth is created. What are the big barriers or gaps that Black Americans face in each of those wealth building stages? And then therefore, what are the interventions? So one big example to your point of what does race have to do with it is a disproportionately high percent of Black Americans live in concentrated poverty. They live in communities that have been underinvested in terms of physical infrastructure, educational infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, and the loss that you have in those years, those early formative years, from being in an environment that's under-resourced stays with you and only tends to actually multiply over time, right? And so if we know effectively where Black Americans disproportionately live, we know the states, we know the counties, how are we coalescing around the right investments that need to be made in those communities to help to kind of start to bolster that infrastructure, right? I can skip ahead to, I'll skip later in the wealth building journey to employment. We know employment is a critical source of wealth creation, right? Income gets invested and saved and becomes wealth. We've got substantial gaps. Set aside the fact that there are educational issues, right? But if you actually try to disaggregate something like the pay gap, so let me give you an example. The pay gap between Black Americans, Black men and white men in the 70s was around 80%. That gap today has actually gotten worse. The average Black man makes 70 cents on the dollar compared to the average white man. For women, it's actually interesting. In 1970, it was around 95% of a white woman. Today, it's closer to 70 or 80%. So they've gone backwards even more on a relative basis. If you dig into why that is, and the San Francisco Fed did some extensive work on this, there are a number of factors that can explain it. One example goes back to community context, educational attainment. If you get less education, you have less earnings potential. We know that. Another factor that explains it is industry selection. So we know that there's something going on in the industries that folks end up in that account for some of it. What was most interesting is the biggest single contributor to the pay gap was not explainable by any factors in the model. And that leads to things like, is there discrimination embedded in the system? Even if you attain the same level of education, are there quality of education issues, opportunity creation for certain populations? And so there's this whole big thing which is not explained by any traditional factors, and it gets to some of these harder societal discussions that we have to have about systematic racism and discrimination, which is deeply embedded in some of the structures that we operate under.
So you're saying that even when you go and do all of the things that you've been told to do all of your life, there still may be some factors that contribute to it not being even in terms of being able to advance as individuals, as a community, and being empowered and all of that. So have you thought about any solutions to that, even though I know you were focused in a specific area, and these, as you said, these things are beginning to surface. I don't want to take your next paper and put it out here yet, but are there things that you're thinking about that you want to write and address when it comes to that, because there are people, as you know, people that live with you, your family members, think that just because you've obtained some title or you're a partner at McKinsey or what have you, that, hey, what are you complaining about? Everything is just going to be rosy, peachy, creamy, but they're measuring it against something that they have as a mental model, whereas your mental model for that, because of your experiences, is a little different. And did you want to expand on any of that?
Yeah, I think there's two paths, and some of my colleagues have done extensive research on the economic value to private, or publicly traded companies, we'll call them, and diversity, right? So one tact is to just actually articulate the economic, even if you don't believe in the social side of it. Right. There's a set of economic benefits. So the first thing is to continue to disseminate those messages, to say, hey, even if you don't care about the social side of this, there's something in it for you. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is continuing to just publish the lack of progress, like creating just incredible transparency, a little bit of a naming and shaming campaign. That works. It works inside of institutions, and I think it works for society more broadly. Institutions and organizations are competitive, so they don't want to look bad. So I think continuing to try to find ways to force transparency of what's actually going on, for example, for progression at various corporations from entry level through to the C-suite and the board of directors. So I think that's a second piece. And then I think the third one is, and it's a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but there's extensive research and training going on around inclusion and equity. And I think what I love, the new terminology, which is it's not sufficient to not to not be racist but to be anti-racist. So embedding this idea of, if you do nothing and you act oblivious to it, then you're part of the problem, and you can't just absolve yourself by saying, I'm not doing these things that I think are racist or biased, but really having a discussion at all levels of all institutions about being proactive about addressing some of these systematic biases that exist in your respective companies or institutions.
So you're saying that we can begin to make sure that people understand there is something that could be of value to you. There is a value proposition for making some of this change, that if we don't see it, that we should work to force some of this change. And in some cases, making sure that we continue to name and shame these kinds of things. And I think that's what organizations like the one that I'm representing today and others who have been collaborating are in the mindset and have been doing historically, but now have an opportunity to do it at an even deeper level. Let's talk about Black and brown small businesses. Are they more vulnerable than they've ever been today?
Without question. This is one of the great, crises inside of a broader crisis that we have probably seen, since the Great Depression. So if you just look at the types of businesses, the types of sectors that Black-owned businesses are in, they are sectors that are substantially more likely to be disrupted in the context of these kinds of shutdowns or slowdowns. So very, very heavily skewed towards hospitality and leisure and construction. And at the time when we wrote this piece on COVID-19, investing in Black lives and livelihoods, we said 40% of Black-owned business revenues are in industries that would likely be disrupted. That's compared to 25% for all U.S. businesses. So wow. Substantially more risk. And unfortunately, I was actually sitting in a discussion this morning where they actually flashed up the demographic information on what's happened with businesses failing. And we didn't have a crystal ball, and I'm sorry that we were so close, but 41% of Black businesses have failed during this crisis.
Wow. So 41%.
41% have failed or on the brink of failure. And so we've got just a major crisis on our hands because the thing that people, it's not the same, and I don't want to belittle losing a job, but it's not the same as losing a job in many instances because not only is your income tied to your business, your wealth that you have is oftentimes tied up in that business as well. And so to the extent that you got yourself a little bit over levered because you borrowed to try to survive and life didn't come back on, I mean, you're pretty much done, absent some sort of external support and injection. What do we know about Black families and communities? Again, the wealth and liquidity levels are so low. Who do you even go to turn to get that help and support?
Right. So is there a theme of the type of businesses that you've seen having these kind of challenges during this time?
Yeah, I think it's any of these businesses that require that people come in and receive a service that they need to receive in person, right? Whether it's a barber shop or a restaurant or bar, all those kinds of businesses where you're providing an in-person service. It's hard to do. You can't do or deliver the service or good remotely. These are the businesses because of the aggressive shutdowns. Let me be clear. I believe that taking extra precautions with respect to health and lives is first and foremost the most important thing. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have stringent lockdowns that ultimately hurt business. I think that being said, we have to also understand who are the populations and businesses that will be hit the hardest, and then we need to be thinking about as private and public sector, contributors, what are we going to do to support those businesses? Because the right answer is to be closed down so that we're not causing infectious spread to increase at an even more rapid rate.
But even when we're not causing infectious spread because we've locked down, there are lots of other, there's lots of impact that we as a community know happen when the beauty shop, barbershop, restaurants you're used to going to, churches, and all these spaces that are sacred spaces for us, where conversations, mental health, even wealth has been developed historically, are being shut down. So when the dust settles, how are you advising, or what is your thinking about how we should be advising some of these businesses to move forward?
Yeah.
Because you said if you weren't prepared for what's coming because of your ability to do this remotely and all of that, so what should we be recommending to people who still are just adamant about trying to do their business going forward?
Look, a few thoughts. So I think in this moment, taking all of the necessary precautions to deliver your service in a way that is safe is first and foremost, right? Even if that means that you scale from down to 60% of your capacity, don't cheat around the edges because it's not worth it. It just isn't worth it. We know that Black Americans are more likely to contract the disease because we work. That person coming into the barbershop, 30% of Black workers work in high contact essential service jobs. Right. So that person is more likely to have. They also live in places with typically weaker health infrastructure and lower testing. So likely to have it and not know it and not be able to get tested. And then lastly, more likely to have a comorbid condition that exacerbates the impact of COVID. So don't cheat around the edges. I think that's one point. I think the second is, as you come out of this crisis, and it's not going to work for all businesses, but as you think about evolving your business model, what are the ancillary services or other things that you can offer that help you through a crisis where the in-person is shut down, right? So whether it's a restaurant or how are you accelerating what you're doing with delivery and takeout in a way that helps to bolster and let you survive in a world that looks a little bit different. You know, prepackaged meal plan, evolving your business model so that you're a little bit more diversified, right? And then the third piece of this is not for the businesses, but I think for leaders in the financial services sector, in government, how are we supporting our Black-owned and community so that they can be there to provide resources when folks come out of this crisis, capital resources? How are we encouraging the fintech players to develop products and offerings to help these? What government programs are going to come now during the crisis and then post-crisis to bolster the liquidity position of these organizations so that they can rebuild and grow?
Should we, are there any things that you would recommend in that space around government and private sector support for Black and brown people, homeowners, businesses, so that we can stop losing some of these assets and resources that we've had, the limited amount that we've been able to build up, as you sort of note, both in your in the conversation?
Absolutely, and I think that, again, this goes back to there's something in it for me. The reality of it is every individual has a vested interest in supporting the most vulnerable communities in this country weather this crisis. We are worse off if there are widespread bankruptcies and people lose all their businesses and there are less jobs. So we did some work to look at pre-pandemic. If we could close the wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans, what would that be worth to the U.S. economy? We found it would be worth between $1 and $1.5 trillion of economic GDP contribution. That is a that number is bigger than the economic expansions that occurred in the last couple of recessions, kind of trough to peak. So everyone benefits from that, right? What that means is that means asset values go up across the board for everyone. That means there's more people shopping and buying goods from all businesses. So I say all that to say, banks who have the ability to extend loans and credit, and they have to do so obviously responsibly because they have a set of shareholders and we don't want to create knock-on effects, but they have an obligation to and have a vested interest in understanding how their actions might lead to knock-on situations of mass defaults in certain neighborhoods, business closure. And so I do really think about looking at the policies that are in place and taking a little bit of an equity lens to say, this standard policy I have on foreclosure, what will it do to the Black population? And taking this equity lens to some of the decisions that are made. And I would say that that's just general advice. And then again, going back to who are the organizations that are best suited to support these communities? Organizations like the Urban, the people that are in the communities that have relationships that are trusted. How are we supporting those organizations and leveraging their unique footprint and access to help people in these communities, whether it be individually or businesses? And again, it goes back to the same idea around supporting community banks and organizations that have a natural history and natural ability to deploy capital in these communities.
So speaking of deploying capital, what do you see as a role for philanthropy in this, or these funds, these foundations, Blacks in philanthropy? What do you see as a role that we should play in that? In this space?
Look, I think there are two separate threads on this. The first one is the here and now, and that is, how do we use our philanthropic dollars to mitigate the worst potential outcomes of this crisis that we're not even halfway through, right? So how are we deploying capital to increase testing, right? To support the community health worker infrastructure to accelerate treatment? What are we doing to support individuals who may be suffering from job loss, and then therefore there's issues with food and childcare? And so very tactically, what are the handful of things that as philanthropists we can do to mitigate these outcomes in the here and now. That's one. The second thing, which I'm starting to see happen a lot, which excites me, and it's both Black philanthropists, but really it's across even many of the big foundations, is how do we use this moment? How do we make this catalytic? How do we turn this into a multi-stakeholder coalition to bring philanthropic dollars and private sector dollars and organize ourselves around 4 or 5 big issues that will fundamentally bend the curve, right? So, and for me, those are access to capital and banking infrastructure as individuals and businesses. There's a big piece of this around education, which starts pre-K and goes all the way through college, and it links to the future of work. There's another big one around healthcare, access to affordable healthcare in locally where people live and work. And then this whole piece about how do we use technology and digital as an enabler for a lot of the things that I just said. If the philanthropic community can coalesce around 3 or 4 big ideas like that, and if we can collaborate, right, in a what I'll call a broader community of practice, so that we're not just operating in silos, we can make a massive difference in this moment. And that I think is what I'm hoping will come from this.
So I know we could be here all day talking about this, because I love those 4 pillars you sort of set up. But because I've been in this education space for a while, and I have a chance to talk to you, bring your brilliance to unpack the education piece for me. Are there any ideas you have around that space, and what we could be doing to sort of support that piece of it? Because we know that you're sitting here, because of not only your exposure level, which has been extremely helpful to you, but also your exposure to kind of education you were able to get along the way. So you talked about access to capital, education, healthcare, and technology. So I'm not going to have you unpack all of them, because you did most of them already. Give me a little bit about education, and then I'm going to give you, we're going to rewind. Since we rewound this program today, we're going to remix a little bit and let you go. I want you to give me, because I know that mind is working, I can see it in your eyes, if you had any other ideas on closing the wealth gap you wanted to share. So hit me with the education thing, and then if there's something we missed on closing the wealth gap, hit that, and then we'll go on to some further questions. All right? Sure.
Okay. Absolutely. And look, an education for me is so fundamentally important to closing this wealth gap, as you know better than I. And so I won't profess to be an expert in education. In fact, I have many colleagues who know it much better than me, and I've been learning from them. But the ideas that we've talked about at a fundamental level, right, is, first and foremost, this idea that school funding and outcomes and quality of education should be solely almost governed by the block you live on just doesn't work. It doesn't work under the construct of living with extreme economic segregation. And so if we're gonna, if we take for a given that we're gonna keep the levels of concentrated poverty for now, living, on top of each other, and we just say that's gonna be the way it is, we have to find a way to make it such that the school environments don't reflect or magnify that level of poverty, right? And so I think there's certainly the way that schools get funded, and you can play around a little bit with that from a resource perspective, and so there's probably some creative things that you could do there. I think there is a role for the private sector to play here, or whether it's thoughtful charter schools, and I think there are other solutions that are outside of the public school system that can be developed to be economic. But I think at the core of it, the quality of the education, the resources in the school, the quality of the teacher, keeping the bar quite high on that, these are things that we have to be talking about at the kind of K through 12 level. And then I think the second thing is when you start to get into higher education, how do we increase the access to higher education, the affordable access to higher education, and that's at all institutions, right? I mean, I think everyone has a role to play, from community schools to community colleges to HBCUs have a big role to play there, and they played a big role historically. I think I've been spending a little bit of time on the HBCU, in the HBCU space. I think there's a huge opportunity, if bolstered, to scale some of those institutions in a different way with infrastructure, with infrastructure improvements and things like that. I think the state and city systems, I think they played a big role traditionally, but we just need to be upping the educational attainment level, right? I mean, I'm going to forget the numbers exactly, but I think it's something like, if you have a 10 to 15% less chance of having your job be automated as a young Black man if you have a bachelor's degree versus a high school degree. I mean, that's a staggering difference. And so I think there's two things, right? There's a quality of education, and then there's upping the level of attainment for certain groups. And those are the two areas that I know folks, Dr. Molly, that you've been very focused on over time, and I think we've got to continue to shine a light on some of the issues there.
Yeah, I just had to ask that question because, lots of my colleagues are on this call, and I wanted to make sure that we did not just move without having someone who's been given some thought to this, at least comment in that area. And so when you think about some of the, I always listen to people talk about lots of the historical data, and they talk about particularly we in Boston tend to talk about some of the exclusionary financial products that keep Black and brown communities from generating wealth, from redlining to credit score to higher interest loans and bank fees. You mentioned lots of that. So how do we unlock this full financial inclusion puzzle that we have?
Yeah.
How do we sort of work to unlock that?
Look, I think you're absolutely right that this, to me, some people, I think, have the belief that the reason that Black Americans are underbanked or have less access to credit or have lower home ownership or own homes at usurious rates is because they don't have wealth. They're missing the core point that access to those things is what is required to create wealth, right?
Yes.
It's the bridge between income and wealth. And so there are a few thoughts I have. So one, it starts with the mainstream financial institutions who are already in these communities. Revisiting, and by the way, a number of institutions are having this discussion. I personally have had this discussion with a few leading financial services companies. Reviewing the product portfolio in terms of how both the products offered and how the decisions are made, and bringing in third parties to say, is there bias in this process, right? So it starts there with redeveloping the strategy if you're a big financial institution. That's one. The second thing, which I think both is an opportunity for these organizations, but also to put pressure on traditional institutions, is financial technology companies using these these nascent technologies and these scrappy companies who are fighting for market share. That's every entrepreneur's dream, is to say there's a set of customers not being served, or there's a set of customers being served at a price point that's too high, that doesn't really reflect the risk profile. And so really supporting fintech players, particularly entrepreneurs of color, to go in and develop things that will put pressure on bigger institutions is the second piece of it. And then the third is the government, in its role as watchdog, has to be enforcing these things. We've seen study after study done by think tanks or private sector organizations where they've done these double-blind things around applying for business loans or applying for mortgages where you send someone in that's black, you send someone in that's white, they got the same credentials, but the black guy is asked for 75 more pages of documentation. The government in its role as watchdog has to keep the system honest, because over time, maybe not, it's not institutions. Sometimes we conflate and we paint a broad brush, but individuals in institutions look for things that might be shortcuts or just frankly display bad behavior. So reevaluation of the product portfolio and processes in mainstream finance, supporting the fintech infrastructure, and then 3, government in its role as watchdog. And sorry, I forgot the 4th one I mentioned early, which is supporting our community development banks and minority depository institutions in not just with capital, but actually revamping the operating model, upping the infusing additional talent, and then also capital to help those organizations who are already situated in the community help to inject that capital.
So speaking of the black guy, Raphael Bostic was named, as you know, the first black Federal Reserve president in the central bank's 106-year history. Now he's looking at a proposal for the Fed to target black unemployment. If you had an opportunity to whisper in his ear and advise him, what would you tell him?
Yeah, look, I think the good news about that role is it's very influential, even indirectly, even outside of the core things that are in the remit. I think on the job front, for me, this is about going to the companies that are the big job creation engines in this country. Both the ones that have historically been like a Walmart, for example, but then also the tech players who will, even though they leverage technology and maybe they're less people intensive, there's still people in tech. Like Amazon still has a lot of people that work there, right?
Yeah.
And I think it is about convening the 50 companies who create jobs and using a little bit the bully pulpit to have a direct conversation about job creation, not in some amorphous way, but let's create 1 million jobs that are earmarked for Black Americans, and let's agree we're going to be transparent. At the end of it, so oftentimes these discussions, Dr. I get to, it's actually not that complicated. It really is about just having a discussion, but the hard part is getting people to sign up and agree to be transparent.
Right.
And the more that we can just have those discussions, it's the same way in my organization, and I'm not picking on any company, it's just anyone who's creating jobs. If we want to get more Black jobs, we need to go to them and say, you need to create Black jobs and you need to be transparent about it, and everyone will be better off. And it's the same thing. I'm having the same dialogues at McKinsey. Okay, we made some progress in some areas. How do we, and you may have seen our 10 commitments. We committed to doubling Black hiring over the next 4 years and doubling our number of Black leaders. And trust me, I'm going to do everything I can in my power to, and it's not, and I don't have huge power. I don't want to overstate it at McKinsey, but I can certainly agitate and hold us accountable to ourselves. And you've got to have people inside these companies doing it, and then you've got to have outside stakeholders like people that are, members of the Federal Reserve boards, also trying to hold people accountable.
And so again, you go back to that naming and shaming. So you mentioned 2 of the 10. Did you want to say any more about the 10 things that you're doing within the company? You said 2 of them.
Yeah, sure. So there's a few things that there's a list of 10. I'll give a few. There's a few that are relevant. So 1, we are creating or formalizing this Black economic think tank. So much of the work that myself and my colleagues have done over the last few years has been in the context of various convening events and things like that. But now let's go ahead and formalize it and build an endurable think tank that can live on beyond the policies
Mm.
that are driving it today. So that's
Wow.
and I'm excited about that. The second is we are rolling out a Black Leadership Academy. So basically, we've got a digital offering that helps build both leadership skills as well as capabilities on specific content areas, whether it's finance or strategy, et cetera. And we're rolling out this program free of charge to our clients to send their Black executives there for a series of virtual trainings over an extended period of time. So that's another thing that we're in the process of rolling out. And then there's other things like upping our commitment to supplier diversity, as well as kicking off a few high impact partnerships with Black-led organizations where we contribute both financial capital, but also in-kind contributions, intellectual capital, if you will, to help them achieve their mandate. So I'm excited. We got it on paper, and now we're all a group of the lead and leadership around the globe has been I've been shocked to be talking to senior partner colleagues in Europe and Asia about how we're going to fulfill these commitments in the US, but also what things might be relevant in Europe and in Brazil. And so I'm encouraged, but there's a lot of work to do.
So yeah, you just did some free consulting for several of the folk that are on this call today. And I wanted you to share that information because I do know that that's what you're doing it for. You wanted to have deep impact. And so that's why I asked you to sort of unpack it a little more for me, because for people to think about formalizing things like a think tank and Black Leadership Academy and working with your stakeholders in ways that will be able to do some pro bono work to help them do business and live life differently has been amazing. We've been so proud here in this city that several of our next generation of leaders who've been out here doing incredible work have come together to develop a fund and are going to begin to address some of these issues on their own as a group. And so we're very, very proud of that work. And so as we're getting to the end of this conversation, I wanted to just give you a chance to, is there anything that you wanted to bring to talk about in regard to the criminal justice system and its impact on us as a community in creating wealth and those kinds of things that you wanted to unpack for folks?
Yeah. Look, I think there's a couple. Thank you for raising that, because I think that's obviously a huge issue for our community. I have a few things that I would say on this. One, I think we need to continue to collectively agitate good trouble, right? Peace, good trouble, as the term.
There you go. There you go.
But continue to do so in a way that elevates the dialogue, not diminishes it, but uses people's names and really tries to play on that collective empathy, because I do think that the vast majority of Americans do care and do want to see a change here. Many weren't actually aware or willfully ignorant of what's been going on. So I think that's one piece of it. The second piece is, as employers or people who work in institutions and can influence, or business owners, how are we thinking about engaging with formerly incarcerated people? And how do we unshackle them since they've paid their debt to society and help unleash their human potential, right, in a way that benefits certainly them, but benefits all of us? And I think that's an important thing that not enough people are talking about, right? But if you don't do that, then the likelihood of being reincarcerated because people don't have options and people are desperate is obviously increases if you're not having that dialogue as a society. And then the third thing is understanding the way dynamics play out, and who are the people in the communities that are actually shaping the way that the criminal justice system plays out, right? Whether it's a district attorney in a certain place. Understanding that person's philosophy on the relationship between poverty and crime, the relation, the notion of, do they believe in one standard for criminal justice or two? Understanding who those local attorneys are, who actually can help shape and craft the way things actually happen on the ground, I think is something that I've become even more aware of during this crisis. And so those would be the three things for me.
So finally, our people are going back to work. They're putting their lives on the line to provide goods and services. As you said, many of them have been given across the country opportunities to open up again. So what protective measures should we absolutely put in place? What would you want to make sure that we have in place so that we can continue to thrive and be healthy and those kinds of things?
Look, I think first and foremost, follow the science. And even if you're in a state or a city that is not following the science, you have agency. It may be hard to do, but it makes sense to follow the science. That's one. Two, it's a no-brainer, but making sure that the PPE and the redesign of whatever the institution is fits the standards required for social distancing and ventilation. You have to do that.
You can't have people passing out because they don't have the right mask on and that kind of thing.
Exactly. So upgraded PPE and the infrastructure requirements, to reopen. And if things, which goes a little bit in line with the science, and if things start to feel like they're going the wrong way from a health perspective, be conservative, right? Be conservative, because at the end of the day, the health and lives thing is the most important part of this crisis. And I fear that we're at a point now in this country where we have not flattened the curve nationally, and we don't live in a place. People talk about states, but we don't have any hard borders or boundaries. So if one state has a bad outbreak, we all have a bad outbreak. And so the more we can do in the near term to follow the science, to be safe, to get tested, the more likely we can all open up earlier than if we don't follow those rules in any one part of this country.
Well, listen, I want to thank you, man. I really do want to thank you, you and also McKinsey and Company. Thank you for being here with us today. What's been really, when I sit here and I look at you and I've read what you've written and those kinds of things, and that's one phase of it. To be able to come on this kind of space, light up the screen, keep people interested for this last hour of good conversation, and share some incredible information in a way that is something that we can all comprehend. Is just amazing. So thank you for just being you, man. I am just so looking forward to what you continue to do in your space, and that we all can do together in our spaces to get to the kind of opportunities in the future for our community that will empower them in ways that are unprecedented. And so not only do I want to thank Shelley Stewart III, and we'll give him a virtual round of applause for being here today, but I also want to thank our audience for tuning in. And I want you to look out for the next Leaders Over Lunch series event. You're going to hear about it on Facebook, LinkedIn, in the streets, in the barbershop, in the hair shop. You're going to hear about it lots of places. If you happen to go to the mall or to the park, if you're on the golf course, you're going to hear about it. But I also welcome you to become a member of the Urban League, the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. Visit our website, www.ulem.org, for more details. When you go on that website, you're going to find out that we have an incredible Urban League Guild led by Kim Emisial, who's their president. You're also going to find out about our Young Professional Network, And Kristen is an incredible leader, but you're also going to find out about what we do for youth and for families. But the most important thing you're going to find out is all the collaborators and partners that we have. We're proud to stand with our historic partner, the NAACP here in Boston, and others. And so grateful for you to tune in today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Shelley, thank you, thank you, thank you. You've made my day. It's
Thanks,
a beautiful.
Uncle Pete. I appreciate
you got it.
You're one of my heroes, as you know. So what a privilege to do this. So thank you so much.
You got it. Stay strong.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.